Hi, everyone. My name is Paloma Diaz. I'm Associate Director of Programs for Lila Benson Latin American Studies and Collections. I want to remind you that there are 19 days until the presidential elections. Early voting has started, and you can learn about your polling locations by visiting vote.org. Well, here we are, and we are extremely happy anytime that UT Austin recruits new faculty whose research deals with Latin American and or Latino studies. Our series, Lila's New Faculty Presentation, highlight these new members of our academic community. Today, we're welcoming a new Lila's affiliated faculty. We're honored to introduce to you Dr. Hannah Walker, Assistant Professor of Government at the Department at the University of Texas in Austin. Her research explores the impact of the criminal justice systems on American democracy, with special attention to minority and immigrant communities. Her book, Mobilized by Justice, is available through Oxford University Press and analyzes the impact of the experience with the criminal justice systems on political engagement. Today, we also welcome Dr. Michael Sierra Arevalo, another UT new recruit. He's an assistant professor of sociology, who's also starting this fall. His research shows how danger and violence influence political culture, officer practice, and social inequality. His first book, Peril on Patrol, Danger, Death, and U.S. Policing, is under advanced contract at Columbia University Press. Dr. Sierra Arevalo will join the discussion after Dr. Watkins' presentations, and we will be sharing in the screen their Twitter accounts, so please follow them. As you see from these bios, today we will be discussing a very timely issue, policing. In particular, the political consequences of policing Latinos. Dr. Walkers, please start.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to Lilas and Paloma for having me today. I'm really excited to talk with you a little bit about my book, Mobilized by Injustice, which examines the impact of experiences with the criminal justice system on political attitudes and behavior. And today, and within the context of the book, I also compare and contrast the experiences of whites to Blacks and Latinos. And today what I'd like to do is spend a bit of time talking about the unique experiences that Latinos have with the criminal justice system. And then I'd also like to be able to connect what we know about Latinos into our understanding of the criminal justice system more generally. Okay, so Dina is an activist in the city of Seattle who I met while I was working on this book, and while she was working on a campaign to protest the expansion of the juvenile detention center in the city's historic Black neighborhood. And so Dina became politicized by watching her brother negotiate the criminal justice system, experiencing repeated short stints in jail and navigating the perils associated with prisoner reentry. As a consequence of watching him go through the system, Dina's ideas about how the criminal justice system works began to change. And she began to view the system as a force for group-based inequality and is not geared to protect people like her, people of color, and from marginalized communities, saying to me, for me and for a lot of people who come from poor communities, communities of color, safety is not a thing that exists right now. For those of us who are impacted by prisons, we see every day our safety being taken away. For every family member I lose, I'm less safe. That's a thing that's real for people whose communities are over-policed. That's a thing that's real for people whose families are kidnapped by the state. So concluding that the system is a force for group-based inequality prompted Dina to become active in efforts to resist the expansion of the detention center. And her story is not unique, but is recognizable to activists across the country who have mobilized to end stop and frisk in New York City, organized against police brutality in Ferguson, and organized to resist secure communities and other programs that deputize local police to act as ICE agents. Minorities and the poor are disproportionately likely to have involuntary interactions with the criminal justice system, and policing tactics that are designed to preempt crime make the threat of contact a very real and frequent possibility for individuals who appear potentially criminal or undocumented based on where they live or how they look and dress. And so as a consequence of these policing tactics, almost 30% of adults have a criminal conviction. Latinos accounted for more than half the growth of the federal offenders in the last 25 years. And almost 50% of Black men are arrested before they turn 25. And for every individual who's stopped, arrested, or incarcerated, there's a network of additional folks who, by virtue of their relational connection, witness the criminal justice system in action. And I call this proximal contact. And like Dina, individuals with proximal contact very often learn civic lessons by watching their loved ones negotiate the system. Researchers find that all types of contact, both personal and proximal, across all multiple iterations of the institution, both the criminal justice system more generally, and the sort of part of the criminal justice system that deals, the criminal legal system that deals with immigration, erodes trust in government and diminishes the likelihood of voting. Now, rooting their arguments in theories of political learning, scholars argue that individuals withdraw from politics because the criminal legal system sends the message to individuals who become caught up in it that their negative experiences are a result of their own poor choices. Indeed, the negative messaging of the system is so potent, and the negative consequences of contact are so profound that it leads Lerman and Weaver to write that the racial socialization of the criminal justice system holds little potential for resistance because it regularly conveys to its wards that their fates were due to their choices alone. And so existing research has less to say about the participation of activists like Dina in Seattle, Ferguson, Baltimore, Minneapolis, and in cities across the country. This project, therefore, starts by asking the question, under what conditions do individuals become politically mobilized by their experiences with the criminal legal system? And under what conditions do they become politically demobilized? And I further undertake to examine how these outcomes may vary among whites, Blacks, and Latinos. And so today what I want to focus in on is the road to mobilization for people like Dina, people with proximal contact. And I'd also, once again, like to focus in on the experiences had by Latinos. So racially biased institutions ensure that Black Americans bear the full degrading force of the criminal legal system. And so for that reason, researchers very often focus on the Black-white dichotomy without attention to Latinos, even as this group faces heightened scrutiny by local law enforcement under the auspices of immigration. So immigration reform passed in the 90s in particular seeded the rise of programs like 287G and secure communities, which facilitate cooperation between ICE and local law enforcement. And as a consequence, average annual deportations increased 14-fold between 1996 and 2017. And collaborative programs like these that deputize local law enforcement agencies to carry out the business of immigration are distilled through policing practices that are already in place on the ground, and which leads to the widespread targeting of Latinos, irrespective of citizenship status. And policy changes in recent years have further precipitated the unprecedented rise of the deportation of non-criminal immigrants. And while roughly 50% of immigrants and 75% of undocumented people in the United States are of Latin American origin, over 90% of deportees in 2018 were Latino. Half of Latinos in the United States know someone who's undocumented, and almost a third have an undocumented family member. And so today, I'm going to focus my empirical analysis on this group. And so a chief goal of this aspect of the project is to bring an understanding of immigration enforcement into a larger discussion of the American criminal justice system. Local enforcement of federal immigration policy is a new frontier for the use of extensive surveillance and monitoring, which are key criminal justice tools. And so a focus on Latinos highlights the efficiency with which the system, which is largely understood in terms of the hyper-incarceration of Black men, is deployed against the nation's largest minority group. Moreover, the experiences of Latinos, whose communities are often mixed status, demonstrates the strength of relational ties to Mobilized and highlights that the racially targeted nature of the criminal justice system itself provides a collective fund for political action. So in order to chart out a path by which individuals may be mobilized by their experiences with the criminal justice system, given the deeply negative material and civic consequences of contact with it, I begin from the premise that the criminal justice system targets minorities and the poor for contact, and that this targeting constitutes a threatening policy environment. Preemptive tactics mean that law enforcement employ physical characteristics in order to make assessments about potential criminality. And this means that otherwise seemingly racially innocuous policies and procedures are unequally applied. And so together with the deleterious consequences of contact across every aspect of an individual's life, the unequal application of the law provides ample reason for members of targeted communities to self-defensively mobilize to try to create change for their families and communities. And so following from this, and from Dina's narrative and the other narratives shared with me by activists on the ground, I argue that individuals become mobilized by their experiences when, rather than internalizing their negative experiences as a result of their own poor choices or the personal failings of a loved one, they instead externalize those experiences, viewing them through the lens of injustice and connecting them to a larger set of institutional biases that unfairly target people like them on the basis of race, ethnicity, class, gender, or other group-based identifiers. Within the context of this project, I argue that the primary role for race is in structuring the nature of contact and the types of narratives that individuals have available to them to make sense of their experiences as unjust. And so Latinos, who, as we've already discussed, face heightened scrutiny for reasons related to immigration, and who are uniquely targeted by the criminal justice system through this avenue in ways that are distinct from their status as people of color. And so following from decades of research demonstrating the broad mobilizing capacity of punitive immigration policy, which crosscuts an otherwise diverse community, I argue that Latinos are most likely to be mobilized by their experiences with the criminal legal system when they perceive that they've been targeted for reasons related to immigration, either because they themselves have been stopped on the street and questioned about their citizenship status, or because they have a loved one who's faced detention or deportation. Finally, I argue that voting is the wrong place to look for mobilization that's been prompted by experiences with the criminal legal system. And this is true for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is that many individuals who become caught up in the criminal legal system or who are threatened by punitive immigration policy face institutional barriers to accessing the vote. But we should also expect this mobilization to be manifest in other types of activities because an eroded sense of trust in government that results from experiences with the criminal legal system may likewise be accompanied by a declining belief in the efficacy of elections, even as a newly politicized consciousness compels participation outside of the ballot box. So throughout the course of the book, I draw on 5 different data sets in order to test various aspects of my theory. Today, what I want to do is focus in and spend a bit of time walking you through some of the findings that are derived from one of those surveys, the Latino National Health and Immigration Survey, which was collected in 2015 and affords us the opportunity to develop a rich picture around the types of experiences that Latinos have with punitive immigration policy and targeted policing practices. I'll also walk you through some very quickly through some findings derived from the National Crime and Politics Survey, conducted in 2013, and the multiracial midterm election survey, which both of which allow us to examine whether the findings that and the relationships observed in the Latino National Health and Immigration Survey extend outside the space of immigration specifically to thinking about policing more generally, and also whether or not some of those relationships are limited to Latinos or whether they extend to the other racial groups that are under study in the project. I also conducted 59 in-depth interviews with activists, advocates, and community members impacted by the criminal legal system, 20 of which were conducted with Latinos. And these interviews are particularly useful for uncovering the specific nature of contact that individuals have and the narratives that individuals draw on to make sense of their experiences as systemically unjust. So the Latino National Health and Immigration Survey, once again, was collected in 2015. It includes a sample of 1,493 Latinos, including an oversample of 476 non-citizens. Within the space of this survey, proximal contact was measured by asking individuals whether they knew someone, such as a close friend or family member, who'd faced detention or deportation. And within the context of this survey, about 35% of respondents indicated that they had proximal contact. Now, I argue that given the materially and civically corrosive consequences of contact with the criminal justice system, the punitive immigration policy and targeted policing practices themselves constitute a threatening policy environment. And so just to give a little sense about what that looks like for people in their lives, Eric is a student from San Diego whose mother is undocumented, and in speaking about what that was like and the type of threat that represented for him, he said, "I have to be scared that sometimes she might not come home. When I was a little kid, that was one thing I was scared of. She had to take the bus, and immigration officials were always at the bus stop raiding the bus. I was scared." Likewise, Martin, who also comes from a mixed status family, says, "If I were to succeed, a lot of people would be looking to me, but also into my background, and my family is in my background. And it would be like, hey, we found out that your parents are undocumented. We have to deport them." And so I felt like, okay, I don't want to go to college. And so the impact of this threatening policy environment and targeted policing practices on individuals' attitudes and behaviors in particular is present in the LNHIS. So within the context of the LNHIS, we asked individuals whether or not they would avoid engaging in certain activities so that they wouldn't be asked about their citizenship status. And so that's what this graph shows, or this set of graphs. It shows us the likelihood that individuals would say, yes, they would avoid engaging in these activities so that they wouldn't be asked about their citizenship status, among those with proximal contact in red and among those without proximal contact in blue. And so what you can see is that across all of the activities that were asked about in the LNHIS, proximal contact statistically increases the likelihood that individuals say that they're going to avoid engaging in these activities so they won't be asked about their citizenship status. And so this really demonstrates the extent to which a punitive immigration environment and targeted policing practices really impact individuals' lives in a real and meaningful way, given that they're feeling like they can't engage in very important activities like going to the health clinic or contacting their child's school. And so I've argued that this punitive environment can provide fodder for political action, in particular when people connect their experiences to larger narratives of injustice and when they view them as a reflection of a larger set of institutional biases. So Sophia is, once again, a student from Los Angeles. And in talking about her experiences with law enforcement to me, she told me about a time when she was on a trip with her youth group. So she says, "When I was in South Dakota, I was visiting with the youth group from my church. Someone called the cops on us, and the cops came and detained us all. Even when our chaperones came out and said we were going to a youth conference for our church, they asked us all to provide our social security numbers, and they made sure none of us were undocumented and that there was nothing illegal. And so even me, as someone who is documented, I'm afraid of the cops. They don't care if you're undocumented. They target you because you are a person of color." Likewise, Martin, who indicated that he might think about avoiding going to college or think twice about going to college in order to protect his parents, said, around the community where I lived, a lot of parents were undocumented. So they were always in fear of ICE or immigration or police to come around. It was, in that area, it was like Latino immigrants against politics, against ICE coming in and arresting people and deporting them. Growing up, I kind of felt like that. It was like, okay, it's either with US politics or with my family. I have to pick one or the other. And so within the context of the LNHIS, we find that connecting one's individual experiences to a larger set of institutional biases is not unique. And instead, it's pretty common within the context of our data set. And it's in particular common for individuals with proximal contact. And so within the context of the LNHIS, we asked individuals whether or not they thought that there was a heavily anti-immigrant environment present today and whether or not they'd had experiences with that anti-immigrant environment. And once again, proximal contact is positively and statistically associated with perceptions of discrimination in the LNHIS. Okay, but I've also argued that when individuals view their experiences as a reflection of a larger set of institutional biases, that in and of itself can provide reason to mobilize to try to create change for one's families and one's communities. So Sophia, again, who recounted the story with her youth group, where she was asked about her citizenship status along with the other members of the youth group, goes on to say, if you want to go to the lawyers and you want to fight against the police when the police don't want to help you, they're like, why should I help you out? Your family is undocumented or you are undocumented. I'm not going to win anything from this case. So just seeing that and seeing how ICE has done a lot of roundups in the nearby area, in the fields, I don't want to be someone who just lets the police take over. I want to help the people out, change something. Now, I further argued that we should expect to see mobilization that's prompted by experiences with the criminal legal system manifest in activities other than voting. So the first thing I want to do is show you the relationship between proximal contact and perceived discrimination, where in the LNHIS, I'm using perceived discrimination as a proxy for perceptions of injustice. I would like to show you the impact of those on voting behavior. So that's what this graph is showing us. It's showing us the impact of proximal contact and perceived discrimination on voter registration and the likelihood that individuals said that they voted among citizens in the sample, since non-citizens don't have access to the vote. And here we can see that neither proximal contact nor discrimination is related to voting, with the exception that perceived discrimination is negatively related to voting. Instead, we should expect to see this mobilization manifest in activities other than voting and other types of activities like attending protests, signing petitions, and so on. So David is an immigrants' rights activist in Los Angeles, and I asked him to talk to me a little bit about the types of activities that he thought that it was important to engage in for his community. And he said, and also how he related that to voting. And he said, we thought it was not enough to do institutional advocacy. We had to do work in the community. During that time, there were raids in the community, and we would do immigrant know your rights sessions. We would work with local groups that were fighting for workers' rights because the workers were undocumented. And so here, David's comments really demonstrate how activists on the ground are thinking in broad terms about the sorts of things that it's important for them and for their communities to engage in. And so what this graph is showing is it's showing the relationship between proximal contact and perceived discrimination on a standard non-voting participation index that we asked in the LNHIS, that asked individuals about their likelihood of doing things like protesting, attending community meetings, and so on. And so you can see here that both proximal contact and perceived discrimination are positively associated with non-voting participation. But this isn't what we really want to know. What we really want to know, what we're really interested in, is how do we get from proximal contact, which carries with it all of these negative material and civic consequences, how do we get from there to heightened participation? We want to know to what extent perceived discrimination underlies this positive relationship that we've observed between proximal contact and participation, where the expectation is that absent perceived discrimination, proximal contact will not be related to participation or will be negatively related to participation. So in order to assess this, I employ a moderation analysis and I interact proximal contact and discrimination. So that's what this graph is showing us. It's showing us the expected value of participation on the y-axis, given perceived discrimination on the x-axis, among those with proximal contact in red and those without proximal contact in blue. And you can see that proximal contact without absent perceptions of discrimination is not related to participation. We also see that discrimination in and of its own right is positively associated with participation, even absent contact, but proximal contact in particular takes on that positive relationship with participation when it's combined with perceptions perceived discrimination. So now what I'd like to do is walk you really quickly through a corollary set of findings derived from the National Crime and Politics Survey and the Multiracial Midterm Election Survey. And so the reason that I want to do that, I have a few reasons that I'd like to do this. First of all, within the context of the LNHIS, we had to draw on perceptions of discrimination as a proxy for perceived injustice. Within the context of these two surveys, I was able to field a battery of questions that get closer to perceptions of injustice, that ask individuals to evaluate the types of activities that they think law enforcement engage within the context of their communities. The second reason I'd like to walk you through these two sets of findings is because the National Crime and Politics Survey in particular asks about experiences with the criminal justice system more generally, outside the space of immigration, where the Multiracial Midterm Election Survey asks about contact within the context of immigration. So we can see whether or not these relationships hold across a variety of punitive contexts. And then lastly, we can evaluate, both of these two surveys include subsamples of white and Black Americans as well. And so we can evaluate whether the relationships that we have observed are limited to Latinos within the context of immigration, or if they extend more broadly. So in order to measure perceptions of injustice, in the NCPS in particular, we asked, for each item, please tell us how often you think the police who patrol your neighborhood do these things, stop people in their cars or public places without good reason, treat people like me fairly and respectfully, use excessive physical force or verbally abusive language. In the midterm election survey, we tweaked these items so that they reflected activities that law enforcement might engage in around issues related to immigration. Took these three items, combined them into the Injustice Index. Scoring a very high value on the Injustice Index indicates maximum dissatisfaction with community police, and scoring a very low value on the index indicates maximum satisfaction with community police. And so, again, just starting by looking at the relationship between proximal contact and perceptions of injustice, we can see that across all three groups under study, proximal contact is positively and statistically associated with perceptions of injustice, both as it applies to criminal justice more generally and as it applies within the context of immigration. The other piece of information that's included on this graph is the percent of each group who reports having proximal contact. So in the NCPS, 46% of Latinos indicated that they had proximal contact, and in the MMES, 43% of Latinos indicated they have proximal contact. And so what this graph is showing us is it's again showing us those average marginal effects of proximal contact and injustice on a non-voting participation, where in the NCPS, we again had a standard non-voting participation battery. In the midterm election survey, we were only able to ask about protesting, but across all both measures in both data sets, we can see that proximal contact and injustice are independently and positively associated with participation. These relationships don't necessarily achieve statistical significance for all racial subgroups in all contexts, but are trending generally in the same direction. And then we want to replicate that moderation analysis. So this is that moderation analysis in the NCPS, where once again, what we're seeing is that in particular, among the total sample, proximal contact is not at all associated with participation absent perceptions of injustice. It requires perceptions of injustice in order to yield a positive effect with respect to participation. The only sort of difference here is that for Black Americans, proximal contact, again in the NCPS, which measures experiences with the criminal justice system, generally speaking, for Black Americans, proximal contact is negatively associated with participation absent perceptions of injustice. We repeat this moderation analysis in the MMES. Once again, similar set of findings where proximal contact requires perceptions of injustice in order to yield a positive effect with respect to participation. Perhaps most importantly, what we're seeing is that across all three surveys, across a variety of measures of contact, a variety of measures of perceptions of injustice, 3 different time points and 2 different institutional contexts, we see a similar set of findings, which is that proximal contact becomes positively associated with participation when it's combined with perceptions of injustice, or in the case of the LNHIS, perceived discrimination. Okay, so to sum up where we've been, I began by asking the question, under what conditions are individuals mobilized by their experiences with the criminal justice system, and under what conditions are they demobilized? And I've argued and offered evidence to suggest that individuals become mobilized when they view their experiences through the lens of injustice, when they view their experiences as a reflection of a larger set of institutional biases. Now, the idea that viewing one's experiences as a reflection of a larger set of institutional biases can promote political action is at the heart of theories of group consciousness and linked fate. And scholars elsewhere refer to it as insurgent consciousness. It is foundational to theories of collective action. Now, today we focused in on the unique experiences had by Latinos with law enforcement and immigration. This focus illuminated the means by which, in an era of preemptive policing, law enforcement can be deployed to target the nation's largest minority group. Immigration policy distilled at the community level through local police results in the widespread targeting of Latinos irrespective of citizenship status. Latinos are constructed as immigrants based on their appearance, accent, and language, and immigrants are constructed as criminal via the language of illegality and the penalty of detention and deportation. Experiencing that negative construction via proximal experiences with the criminal justice system increases perceived discrimination among the broader community of Latinos. Latinos interpret their experiences with the system as unjust, and they respond to that injustice by mobilizing against what they see as systemic oppression. But I've also further offered evidence that the mobilizing impact of a sense of injustice extends to all racial groups under study, even as Blacks and Latinos face unique struggles with which whites simply do not contend. So the explicit racial inquiry undertaken by this project lays the groundwork for future research on the Black Lives Matter movement and the myriad of allied groups that lead the current movement for civil and human rights. But the implications of this project are political as well. Even as the criminal justice system creates and recreates deep and lasting racial inequalities, it also creates the possibility for a multiracial coalition to contest its legitimacy and advocate for reform. Rather than feeding back as a withdrawal from politics and an alienation from the political system, discontent with punitive policy is potential political power. And so with that, I want to leave you with one final quote from Dina, whose story opened this talk. In speaking to me about her experiences with the criminal justice system and her reasons for becoming mobilized, Dina said, "The way that we just accept that the violence that is perpetrated through that system is okay it's just unacceptable. It is completely unacceptable. This idea that saying that we matter is a form of resistance of prisons, and like resisting prisons is a form of saying that we matter. As recognition grows of the role the criminal justice system plays in perpetuating racial, ethnic, and other ascriptive hierarchies, so too does the capacity for experiences with the criminal legal system to compel political action." And so with that, I'll conclude and turn it over to Michael.
Paloma, I think you're muted.
Let me try again. Sorry, just before introducing Dr. Sierra Arevalo, I want to remind everyone to post your questions if you're watching on Facebook, on Twitter. In our experience, people post questions in the last 5 minutes and we can never get to them, so post them right now. Dr. Sierra Arevalo, please go ahead.
Thank you, Paloma, and thank you so much, Hannah, for this very insightful presentation on an issue of tremendous importance, particularly in our current climate when it comes to policing, politics, and the broader body politic. I think that my initial question is one that speaks to a current moment where a lot of Americans are awakening to a reality that's as old as the history of the country itself. And that is a history in which Black people in particular, or people of color, have been dehumanized, have been marginalized by state agents in various ways, some that are overt and violent, others which operate through policies, others which operate through laws. And so I was moved by some of the accounts given by the individuals that you spoke with. And this is a good opportunity for me to plug qualitative methods and qualitative data. So thank you for fleshing out those macro level trends with the stories and the experiences of individuals whose lived experience is often pushed to the margins by the way that we choose to collect and make use of data. But one thing stood out to me, in addition to how you've shown that there is a linked fate, a sense of shared Latinidad, which some people awaken to in the course of experiencing oppressive state control. There's also a thread, and I recognize this as well as some of your written work, not just this presentation, that many of these individuals reference specifically people of color more generally. There's obviously the components of my family and my friends who are undocumented, or they themselves are undocumented, but they also frequently reference this broader system which targets people of color, not just those who are undocumented or who have to wrestle with the precarious status of not having papers. And I'm wondering if you could speak to what, to my mind, seems like it could be in some ways, a more fundamental realization that Latinos are also part, or better, are also excluded from a system that privileges whiteness, that upholds whiteness as the status quo and as a privileged category. Do you have some sense that there is something operating either alongside or perhaps underlying this collective realization of Latinidad and the status of being undocumented that's also more about, this is not just a Black problem. This is something that affects people like me too. I am also excluded from the body politic. I am also excluded from systems of power. I don't think I have a way to transition. There we go.
Thank you so much for your question, Michael. And I think all of your comments were really profound. Also, thank you for shouting out the qualitative research part of it, which served to be crucial to the ability to tell the stories that I'm trying to tell. And so I think, so just to answer it in the most straightforward way as possible, the answer is yes, right? And so I'm trying to tell a clean story about immigration, and within the context of the book, it gets a little more complicated because I look at the cleavage of citizenship and I distinguish the experiences of citizens from non-citizens. But that's a too neat telling, right? There's another story that I could be telling that is about how Latinos are also targeted, again, because of their status as people of color in ways that are really similar to their Black counterparts, and that don't have to do with immigration, that are just really about policing and the way that police operate on the ground. And so for many folks that I interviewed, there was absolutely this recognition of like, we're also excluded. This is about whiteness, also about class. I think was a recurring theme among both Black and Latinx folks that I interviewed, and the way that policing interacts with class and spatial geography and, to produce the types of outcomes that it does. And then for other folks, there is, I think, really a genuine learning process that happens specifically because of immigration, right? Where they're saying, as you said, like, oh, this is something that's happening to us too. This is immediately relevant to my life in a way that it might not otherwise have been. But again, those distinctions are easier to draw as an academic and harder to draw on the ground in real life, because a lot of several narratives that were shared with me and stories that were shared with me were about like, oh, my little brother who's undocumented was targeted by the police and, you know, got stopped on the way home from school all the time, got caught up in the juvenile justice system. And part of my really deep fear and worry about what's happening to him is that once he ages out of the juvenile justice system, he's eligible for deportation and detention. And so those systems are not cleanly distinct, as well as those stories not being cleanly distinct. And so for certain, there is this recognition of this is a system that privileges whiteness, and it impacts me and my family as well.
Absolutely. So one thing that I noticed is that there was that rhetoric around this, call it like a supra racial group that came up in the interviews that the pieces that I saw. It concentrated, from what I could tell, among younger Latinos. It concentrated around students. It concentrated around folks that either were at the tail end of public education, or maybe they had gone to a little bit of college. Do you have some sense about how this either super Latino realization or their identification with this broader narrative of the plight of the undocumented is something that is gradated by age? Is this something that you can see broken down more cleanly between lower class Latinos or more educated Latinos, higher class Latinos? What's your sense of that in a more demographic scale?
Yeah, so I mean, part of the youthful nature of the narratives that came out in the book have to do with who was willing to talk to me, to be honest with you, right? And so there's a skew in my interviews, in particular among the Latino community, of college age folks. And part of that is the nature of qualitative research, right? Where very often, you know, there's a trust barrier there. The people who you're able to first start speaking with are people who relate to you on some level. And so there's a skew there for that reason. But having said that, I also interviewed folks who were instrumental in founding and developing the organization Keresen in Los Angeles, which was founded in, I think, 1980, and was founded in response to the Central American refugee crisis and the influx of refugees to Los Angeles. And when I was asking them about sort of how did you start becoming active around this issue? What does it have to do with law enforcement? The response that I got was, it was all about law enforcement. From the very beginning, it was all about law enforcement, because law enforcement were on the street stopping people for no apparent reason and asking them about their citizenship status, and they were getting entered into deportation proceedings. So one of the first things that we did was become organized to try to get Special Order 40 passed in Los Angeles, which ends up being sort of an early version of a sanctuary bill at the city level. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not sure about age, I guess is kind of the answer, because I think there's as you noted, there's a long history of activism around these issues that begin with law enforcement and the presence of law enforcement in the streets. Right. Now, having said that, I do think that, and I've seen this come out in particular among Black Americans, that the younger cohort are more likely to become mobilized, for that to translate into political action. Right. So for that to translate into political action, even if the sort of latent narrative is there for older folks.
And that political action, is that the same kind of action that you highlight in your work, which is non-voting political action, or do we see any kind of shift towards translating that kind of political furor, that awakening, into votes, which in the case of Latinos in the US is particularly salient considering the long history of their voter turnout being lower than Black Americans and white Americans?
Right. So primarily where we see the movement is on non-voting behavior. But I think the thing that I want to say about voting is that the findings that I presented to you, with the exception of discrimination, but when it comes to proximal contact, the findings that I presented to you and the findings that are, I think, in the broader literature around this type of contact are null. They're not negative, right? So the literature would lead us to think that that we should see people withdrawing from voting. A lot of literature around this topic really is looking at people who have had really intense personal experiences with the criminal justice system, and those folks withdraw from voting. But when it comes to people who have had less intense experiences that are proximal, experiences where they've been maybe stopped on the street and questioned, but that didn't lead to an arrest, we see null findings on voting. And I think that's really important because it suggests that there's room there to convert those folks into voters. And now I want to just say one plug for another project that I'm working on currently, which is a Get Out the Vote project. It's a field experiment where we're targeting individuals with felony convictions, but who may nevertheless be eligible to vote because they've completed their terms of their sentence. We conducted a few pilot experiments between January and now, and we're currently in the field right now. But in our pilot experiments, there is suggestive evidence that we can mobilize these folks. That if we reach out to them, talk to them about the fact that they are eligible to vote, provide them with the resources to get registered, that's effective.
That's wonderful. That's tremendous. And that's, my assumption is a relatively small, in the language of kind of behavioral science, it's a nudge. A small nudge then can have a potentially very large effect, or something like voting.
Correct. Yeah.
Thank you to both. We're going to start with the questions, but I have to say that Lila Svensson is very proud to create these spaces of interdisciplinary discussion. So I'm glad that you both find so many interesting angles of comparison between your research. I have a question here from Professor Raul Madrid in the Department of Government. He wants to know if your results, Hannah, vary across different groups within the Latino community, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, etc. Is there a variation between the United States by region?
Okay. Okay, so what I can say, so unfortunately, even as robust as our samples are, they're not robust enough to really drill down on individual country of origin groups. What I can say is that when we control for things like Mexican American origin or Mexican origin, the results persist. So it appears to, so the findings appear to hold even above and beyond just individuals of Mexican origin, which is where we might expect to see quite a lot of activism. The other part of the question, so I guess before I move on from that, the other thing that I want to say is that my expectation would be that if I conducted interviews with folks from different parts of the country, if I went to New York and conducted interviews, most of my interviews come from the West Coast, because of by virtue of where I was located when I was doing the research. If I were to go to other parts of the country, I anticipate that those narratives would look a little bit different. In particular, Puerto Ricans in New York City may have narratives that look a lot more like Black Americans, less unique to immigration. That would be the sort of thing that I would anticipate. But unfortunately, unable to drill down in the large N data on that specifically. The second question is about region. Now, once again, the data within that I've been able to draw on are nationally representative. So it makes it hard to drill down on specific regions within the United States. I will say I've looked at tons of data, scads and scads of data. And this positive relationship between proximal contact and participation is very robust. The one piece of variation that I haven't been able to explore that I think is particularly important has less to do with region of the United States and more to do with the urban-rural divide. Mm-hmm. So part of the story that comes out in the book that I wasn't able to share with you in the talk has to do with the role of community-based organizations that provide the opportunity to participate and that are a natural point of contact between individuals who have had experiences with the criminal, for individuals who have had experiences with the criminal legal system. But we might also imagine that those types of organizations are more readily available in urban spaces than they are in rural spaces. So, so I think that that's probably the cleavage that has a lot to give, but which I've been unable to examine.
And Michael, about that, would you like to add something, or we can go to the next question?
Yeah, so I'm definitely outside of my wheelhouse on what kind of variation we're going to see. I will say that my experience being with police is that the local context with regards to immigration enforcement almost undoubtedly is going to shape the understanding of how law enforcement relates to the local population. I'm thinking about things along in Arizona, for example, when you have the SB order, there is a deep tension between, say, local departments versus sheriff's departments in terms of who is very actively enforcing immigration law. You think about the famous Sheriff Arpaio and his sheriffs versus, say, the Phoenix Police Department that very actively is saying, we do not enforce immigration law. We are looking to build relationships with the Latino community. We're not trying to alienate people that we depend on to report crimes. And in my discussions with officers in other parts of the country, it is very clear that they have to at least perceive that many Latino citizens do not have a fine-grained distinction. That for them, any member of the state is liable to check for papers, to try and arrest them, to try and get them or their family deported. It's unclear to me whether or not there's better understanding of that among Latino communities in different parts of the country, whether or not that variation in how local enforcement is or is not doubling down on federal immigration law influences that. I think that's all very much in the air and in an open place to try and figure out how local context shapes the perceptions and the beliefs of citizens with regard to the state agents that coerce and police them.
Hannah, do you think it's accurate to say that in general Latinos are undercounted in the criminal justice system, since it may be more common to collect data about race but not ethnicity? I mean, I imagine Afro-Latinos may be counted as Afro-Americans but not necessarily as Latinos, for instance, or why Latinos may not be considered Latinos. What was your experience with that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that Latinos are undercounted within the context of the criminal justice system. I actually just had the privilege of hearing a talk given by Ayo Lanayanu, who is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, who undertook to examine the extent to which administrative records of arrests accurately captures race and ethnicity, given that officers are themselves the ones who are very often translating that information. And when they made various corrections to the administrative records, he found that at least in one or two police departments, Latinos were undercounted by half.
This question, I guess, can be for both of you, comes from Sandra Garcia, and it has to do with the culture within the police and also border enforcement. Are they like cross-training? Do they reinforce each other? Do they share common practices? Have you seen any comparison between those two institutions?
I've not seen comparisons between those institutions that I am able that are coming immediately to mind. Local police become particularly important as a mechanism because they facilitate the rise of interior enforcement in the United States away from the border. So if we think about the development of immigration policy, what we know is that first the border becomes heavily militarized and policed, And then in the late 1990s and 2000s, the development that happens is that militarization and that extraordinary policing extends and expands dramatically away from the border and into the interior part of the country. And so that's facilitated by the technology of local law enforcement that's already on the ground. But also to a point that I think Michael made, which is about how local police themselves are not necessarily interested in creating an antagonistic relationship between law enforcement and communities on the ground. A lot of the way in which this expansion happens is through database sharing and through sort of using the space of prisons and jails to be able to check for documentation status when somebody gets picked up and taken down to the station. And so that database sharing is not really about what police are doing necessarily. It's just about using the efficient space of local jails and prisons to begin regulating and begin carrying out immigration policy. And so police themselves may be interacting with the community in ways that are less antagonistic, even as the infrastructure becomes very threatening for Latino communities.
Yeah, one point of clarification that I think for those that are not spending a lot of time thinking about the issue of law enforcement or the criminal legal system in the US more broadly, there's a lot of heterogeneity across the US into how this actually plays out. By and large, when you talk about like the county jail, that's sheriffs, and there is some really good work. So I'm thinking of the work by Amada Armenta in her book on the policing, specifically the use of traffic investigations and licensure as a not explicitly Latino targeted policy and mechanism, but one which gets disproportionately used on Latino drivers as a means of criminalizing what would otherwise just be a ticket, but it turns it into a very intense contact with very intense outcomes, negative outcomes for individuals. But a lot of the story of the direct cooperation between the federal government and ICE, for example, that's happening in jails, and that is the purview of sheriffs. Those are elected officials. Those are not appointed officials like police chiefs. And so once you get down to the ground level, how immigration policy, the law on the books, so to speak, becomes the law in practice, is a lot of gray, is a lot of difference between this town and this town, even the same state. I think one of the original questions, is there interplay between things like CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, and local police? And the answer is yes. Part of it is definitely what Hannah mentioned about database sharing. There are these data clearing houses which connect FBI, CBP, ICE, local sheriffs, local police to alerts about various threats. And so this is kind of where my work focuses on, is threat. Who do you believe poses a threat to you? And what steps do you take to keep yourself as an officer and your fellow officers safe? In one of my field sites, which is in the Southwest, the rhetoric that you hear from CBP officers is much more focused on the border. It's focused on cartels as like this boogeyman, even though the vast majority of what even CBP does has nothing to do with gold-plated AK-47s that you see in the movies and barrels and barrels of cocaine. It's actually much more mundane. It's mostly human rights, a human rights version of social work that they actually have to do most of the time. Similar to police, that most of what they do is not gang feuds and murder and robbery. Most of it is picking up the broken pieces of the social system. But along the border, the rhetoric about things coming across the border posing a threat is very much the same. In some of the recent investigative journalism work on these secret Facebook groups within CBP or within police departments, the rhetoric is the same. The racism is the same. The misogyny is the same. And in part, that's because the institutions themselves they're heavily male. They are heavily punitive. Culturally, they are very similar, even if the specific mandate of the institution is slightly different.
Okay, so to close, let me ask a question about the elections. Do you think that if Trump doesn't win, there will be an impact in the cultural component of the police institution, or the president really doesn't matter within the practice and culture of the institution?
Michael, you want to take that one first?
Sure. I think the short answer is that, so I have, as you might imagine, been paying very close attention to some of the rhetoric from within policing, and I've seen some of it up close and personal. Policing has always been conservative, as far as I'm not a historian, but as far as I can tell, has always been conservative politically. But there's a particularly virulent strain of that has been amplified in recent years. A recent report that I just saw has linked QAnon, for those not familiar. It's this very popular online conspiracy theory. And there are officers that are very publicly, including in New Haven, where I was at graduate school, an officer was publicly podcasting about QAnon conspiracy theories. They've been identified in these anonymous forums online. Unprecedented things like the New York City PBA, the Police Benevolent Association, has come out and endorsed President Trump. Popular law enforcement outlets like Law Enforcement Today are actively producing news stories. It's basically just social media content. News is a strong word to describe what that is. That are in support of President Trump and in support of more punitive policies. Should President Trump win, I don't think there's any reason not to think that those strains of police culture, of the darker and more problematic sides of policing will not become increasingly clear and increasingly overt.
Yeah, I think that's right. That resonates with the way that I think about it. I think that just the last thing that I want to add is that it is, though that is the case and that's super important, we should also not lose sight of the fact that even if Biden is elected, these problems with policing and with criminal justice in the United States do not go away. They're not resolved. They're with us for the long haul. We have a lot of work to do to try to rectify them.
Absolutely.
Thank you to both of you. We're looking forward hosting again our reception so we can meet all our new faculty face to face. And we're looking forward to opening again our library so you can come and walk through the Benson collection, which I'm sure you will appreciate it. Thank you so much to both of you. We're going to keep promoting this video so people can watch it later if they miss it. Thank you.